Here we'll examine the remaining urinary system structures, such as the ureter, the urinary bladder, and the urethra. And we'll examine it from the perspective of urine that is created in the kidney and that is flowing through these various structures. So we're going to see that it will, as it leaves the kidney, the urine will pass through the ureter. It will then be stored in the urinary bladder until it is time to void it. That is, until the bladder fills and it is time to void the urinary bladder, and then at which point it will be eliminated through the urethra. So from the kidney, the urine will flow through the ureter, be stored in the bladder, and then be voided or eliminated through the urethra. Let's examine the ureter for a moment here. So the ureters are passageways that receive urine from the renal pelvis. We can essentially look at them or view them as extensions of the renal pelvis. They're approximately 30 centimeters in length, and these, along with the remaining urinary system structures, do not function in absorption or secretion. So by the time that the urine reaches the ureters, the bladder, and the urethra, the body has no way to modify it any longer. So once it leaves the kidney, the body is unable to reabsorb any fluid, electrolytes, or anything else that's contained within it. We'll see that the walls of the ureters are lined with layers of smooth muscle, which help to propel the urine down to the bladder using these little wave-like contractions that are called peristalsis. So gravity is not sufficient to propel the urine down to the urinary bladder. So instead what we see is that it's actually propelled down to the bladder through these muscular contractions. This slide here shows a cross-section through the ureters, and that we see the lumen, in which is the space that the urine will pass through as it leaves the kidney, and then the bulk of the ureter is composed of layers of smooth muscle that will function in the wave-like contractions that we call peristalsis to move that urine from the kidney to the bladder. We'll next examine the bladder. We see that the urinary bladder receives urine from both kidneys through each of the ureters. So the ureter on the right side of the body will receive urine from the right kidney, and the ureter on the left side of the body will receive urine from the left kidney. In females, we see that the bladder lies anterior to the uterus and posterior to the pubic bone, whereas in males, it simply lies posterior to the pubic bone. And we also see that in males, the bladder is associated or closely associated with a gland that's nearby called the prostate gland. Now, the prostate gland is not a urinary system structure. It's actually a reproductive system structure. We'll briefly talk about it here, but we'll see it in a little bit more detail when we get to the module on the reproductive system. Just like with the ureters, the walls of the urinary bladder contain longitudinal as well as circular bands of smooth muscle that are collectively called the detrusor muscle. It, as I mentioned, just like the ureters, has no way of reabsorbing or secreting anything into the urine that's in it, so the bladder is simply acting as a storage area for urine. Internally, we see that it is lined with transitional epithelium, which helps to keep the inner lining intact when the bladder stretches and fills, because the bladder will distend as it fills. It can hold a few hundred milliliters of urine before there are sensory receptors in it that signal our brain that it's time to void the bladder. We see that a lot like the stomach, it folds elaborately when it's empty. That is, the inner lining of it possesses these very deep ridges and folds in it. They're called rugae, which we also saw in the stomach, that appear when the bladder is empty. There's a small triangular-shaped region at the base of the urinary bladder that's referred to as the trigon, and the trigon consists of the two openings to the ureters, so these are the uretic openings or the uretic orifices, and then there's also the opening or the passageway into the urethra. So all three of these are kind of positioned in a way that they form essentially a triangular shape at the base of the urinary bladder. And clinically, this region is pretty important because it has a tendency to be a site where the bladder can become infected by bacteria if microorganisms make their way up through the urethra into this part of the bladder. So it tends to be a site where bladder infections can typically occur. So here is a diagram showing the cross-section through a urinary bladder of the female urinary system, in which we see the two ureters here, which make their way to the base of the bladder where the uretic orifices open up into the bladder. And so that's the way that urine enters the bladder from the ureters. We also see the rugae that make up its inner walls. So those are the elaborate deep folds that occur when the bladder is empty. Looking at the walls of the urinary bladder, we see the detrusor muscle there. And then in the next segment or the next part of this module, we're going to examine the urethra. The male urinary bladder looks very similar to that in that it possesses a trigon with the uretic orifices and the opening to the urethra. It also has rugae or deep folds that occur or become present when the bladder is empty. Its walls are lined with smooth muscle that's referred to as the detrusor muscle. And in this diagram as well, we also see the right and the left ureters there. So let's take a few moments to examine the urethra, because the urethra is the last structure that we're going to examine in the urinary system. It functions to transport urine from the bladder to the external world or outside of the body during voiding of the bladder. At the place where the urethra connects to the bladder, we see that its walls are lined with a sphincter of smooth muscle that is referred to as the internal urethral sphincter. This muscle, because it is smooth muscle, it is controlled by the autonomic nervous system, which normally when the bladder is not needing to be voided, that muscle will be contracted and that will keep the entrance to the urethra closed. Now, as the bladder starts to fill, that muscle will be stimulated to relax and it will open the opening between the urethra and the bladder as the bladder becomes filled. So the urethra from there will then pass through a muscular wall that's in the pelvic cavity that's referred to as the urogenital diaphragm. So we'll examine both of those structures in the next diagram here. And then there's also some important anatomical differences between the urethra of the female urinary system and the urethra of the male urinary system. So this is a side-by-side comparison here showing the urinary bladders as well as the urethra of a female urinary system on the left and a male urinary system on the right. So in both diagrams we see the bladder here and the urethra, which exits the bladder at the base. It passes essentially underneath the pubic bone in both cases, although they don't really have in this diagram highlighted too well the pubic bone for males. The urethra essentially has two openings. There is an opening between the urethra and the bladder, and then there is an opening for the urethra near the external genitalia, which we'll examine here in just a moment. So in females and males, we'll see, as we just saw in the previous diagram, the urethra is different in length and it also passes through different structures. So we'll examine the female urinary system first. So in females, the urethra passes through the urogenital diaphragm. We see that embedded within the walls of the urogenital diaphragm, there's another sphincter muscle that it passes through, which is called the external urethral sphincter. And the external urethral sphincter is a band of skeletal muscle. So that means that it's voluntarily controlled, and this muscle allows us to void the bladder when it is convenient. So the internal urethral sphincter is reflexively controlled because it is smooth muscle, but the external urethral sphincter is consciously and voluntarily controlled. So that way we can empty or void the bladder only when it's convenient for us to do so. At the opposite end of the urethra, we see the external urethral orifice is embedded essentially in the anterior wall of the vagina, and it's just inferior to the clitoris. And in females, the entire length of the urethra is quite short. It's only about 4 centimeters in length, which is slightly less than 2 inches. And this configuration or this structure is what permits bacteria or microorganisms to more easily move from the urethra to the bladder, which is why in females there tend to be more frequent urinary tract infections than we see in males, simply because the length of the urethra is much, much shorter. So here we see at the opening to the urethra, between the urethra and the bladder, we see the internal urethral sphincter, which, as we mentioned, is a sphincter made of smooth muscle. The very short urethra passes through the external urethral sphincter, which is a band of skeletal muscle, which allows voluntary control and relaxation of that muscle when it is appropriate to do so. And then here we see the external urethral orifice. So finally, we will examine the urethra in the male urinary system. Just like with the female urinary system, we see that the urethra exits the bladder and possesses a band of internal urethral sphincter muscle, which is a band of smooth muscle that reflexively contracts and relaxes. But we see in males there's a slightly different configuration that immediately after leaving the bladder and passing through another structure, the structure that it passes through is the prostate gland, which is a gland that's going to be heavily involved in producing secretions, or some of the secretions that are found in semen. So this will play an integral role in the male reproductive system. But the prostate gland is not a urinary system structure, even though it is very closely associated with the urinary system. So we see that the urethra will pass through the prostate gland. After exiting the prostate gland, just like in the female urinary system, it passes through the urogenital diaphragm. And just like in the female urinary system, we also see that that urogenital diaphragm contains the external urethral sphincter, which is the skeletal muscle sphincter. So from there, from the urogenital diaphragm, the remaining length of the urethra passes through the length of the penis, and it is referred to as either the spongy urethra or the penile urethra, because the tissue that it passes through is the erectile tissue of the penis. The external urethral orifice is located at the tip of the penis, and the entire length of the urethra in males is approximately 20 centimeters, which is about 7 inches in length. And in males, the urethra also functions as a passage for sperm and semen during ejaculation. So we see that it is a structure that has some shared functions with the reproductive system, which is something that we do not see in the female urinary system. So even though the female urinary system, including the urethra, is in very close proximity to the female reproductive system, it has no direct connection to it. So those are some important differences that we see between the male and female urinary systems. So similar to the female urinary system, we see that the opening between the bladder and the urethra contains the internal urethral sphincter, but unlike in the female urinary system, we see that in males, the urethra immediately passes through the prostate gland, and the region of the urethra that passes through the prostate gland is referred to as the prostatic urethra. It will then exit the prostate gland and pass through the urogenital diaphragm, in which case we refer to that as the intermediate part of the urethra. Just like with the female urinary system, we see that there is an external urethral sphincter composed of skeletal muscle, and then from the urogenital diaphragm, we see that the entire remaining length of the urethra passes through the spongy erectile tissue of the penis. And we see the external urethral orifice being located at the tip of the penis.